There are moments in life that don't just shape you, they define you. I remember standing under the brilliant ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, heart pounding, surrounded by the weight of centuries and saints. But what marked me most wasn't the grandeur of the space. It was a quiet moment, a tear, a gesture, and the call to something far greater than I ever imagined. My journey didn't begin in Rome, and it certainly didn't end there. It began in Manila, with nothing but faith, fire, and a desire to serve. This is my story, not of climbing ladders, but of kneeling in surrender. And if you've ever asked, what does it truly mean to lead? This testimony is for you. I didn't expect to cry that day. Not there, not then, and certainly not in front of millions of people. But as Pope Benedict XVI gently placed the red biretta on my head, I felt something far heavier than fabric. It was the weight of responsibility, the echo of prayers from countless voices back home, and the overwhelming presence of God Himself. I felt the eyes of the Church, yes, but more than that, I felt the gaze of heaven. That tear wasn't weakness, it was clarity. In a single moment, everything I thought I knew about leadership, power, and faith was turned upside down. I wasn't being elevated. I was being lowered into deeper service, into a space where love mattered more than logic and mercy more than merit. That red color meant martyrdom, a daily dying to self. And standing there, I knew. This was not a promotion. It was a crucible. From the outside, many saw a celebration. For me, it was consecration. I wasn't stepping into privilege. I was stepping into pain, into the suffering of the world, into the brokenness of the Church, and the beauty buried within it. I realized something essential. Authority in God's kingdom doesn't look like dominance. It looks like tears. And those tears, streaming silently, told the truth of a heart not reaching for the spotlight, but laid bare on the altar of surrender. I flew home to Manila not as a hero, but as a servant. The streets were filled with processions, flowers, and songs, but I carried something quieter inside me, a deeper resolve. The people weren't celebrating me. They were placing their hopes in something much bigger, a church that listens, a shepherd that walks beside them. In every hug, every banner, every whisper of Cardinal Tagle, I heard a question behind their joy. Will you remember us when Rome forgets? And I knew the answer had to be yes, not because of ambition, but because of covenant. You see, I wasn't raised in corridors of power. I grew up in the crowded streets of Manila, in the scent of incense and sweat, where mothers prayed over rice pots and fathers worked 2 jobs to send their children to school. My formation didn't come in marble halls, but in kitchen tables and catechism classes. My first confession wasn't behind a screen, but in front of a statue, weeping because I had lied to my mother. That's where my theology began, in the deep humanity of the Filipino soul. And when I stood in Rome, I didn't carry diplomas in my pocket. I carried their stories in my heart. Some said I was too young. Others said I was too soft. They didn't know that softness is not the absence of strength. It's the proof of it. I had walked with grieving mothers, held hands with prisoners, and sat beside men dying of hunger and guilt. I had preached funerals where no one came, and I had danced with children who had nothing but joy in their hearts. That's where I learned that pastoral care isn't about doctrine. It's about presence. Not standing above, but kneeling beside. That day in Rome, when I was handed the red, I thought of them, the unseen, because it was never about my name. It was about their hope. That's the truth about moments like these. The world watches one thing, but God writes another. While cameras zoomed in on a tear, heaven saw a yes to serve the poor, the broken, the cynical. A yes to hold my tongue when the world demands noise. A yes to be misunderstood, overlooked, and still remain obedient. That moment was not a beginning. It was a continuation. I had been saying yes long before anyone knew my name. And I say it again today, not because it's easy, but because obedience is always worth it. And in the tear that day, I met my calling. This story isn't just about red hats and sacred halls. It's about you. Yes, you watching this. You who have felt invisible. You who wonder if God sees your tears. I promise you, He does. And sometimes He lifts up those tears as banners, not for fame, but for faith. If you've ever felt unworthy, uncertain, unnoticed, this is your invitation. Because the God who called me calls you too. Not to platform, but to presence. Not to be praised, but to be poured out. So don't wait for recognition. Kneel now. Say yes. That's where real authority begins. I never planned to become a symbol. And if I'm honest, I never wanted to. Symbols are distant, clean, untouchable. I have never felt untouchable. I have felt hunger, grief, fear. I have buried friends, listened to confessions that broke my heart, and watched as dreams were crushed under the weight of poverty and politics. So when people began calling me the Asian Francis, I didn't feel honored. I felt responsible. It meant they were watching me not for who I was, but for what I represented. And that meant every word, every silence, every tear mattered. It meant I could not afford to speak from theory. I had to speak from truth. The truth is, compassion is exhausting. When you love deeply, you bleed often. There were nights I wept alone after listening to someone's story, powerless to fix their pain. I knew theology, but it didn't matter when a father begged for his child's healing. I had no miracle to give him. All I had was presence. And strangely, that was enough. I learned that listening is its own form of healing, that mercy doesn't always look like a solution. Sometimes mercy is just not turning away, just staying, just bearing the unbearable in silence, with them, for them. I began to see that people weren't asking for perfect leaders, they were asking for real ones. Not icons in cassocks, but shepherds who smelled like the sheep. That's what Pope Francis always said, and I understood it in my bones. I could have hidden behind doctrine, behind robes, behind walls of tradition, but I chose instead to walk barefoot into their lives, even when it cost me, even when it meant criticism from those who thought I was too emotional, too simple, too soft. I wasn't trying to please them. I was trying to stay faithful to the one voice that truly mattered, God's. Some people think leadership is built in moments of applause. I've found it's forged in moments of silence, the kind of silence where no one claps, no one praises, and yet you serve anyway. The kind of silence where faith is tested, not displayed. And so when cameras stopped following me, I didn't change. When the whispers in Rome grew louder, will he be the next pope? I didn't start campaigning. I started praying more, because I knew what the world often forgets, that power without prayer is just performance. And I had no interest in performing. The expectation crushed me at times. People would look at me and see something I didn't see in myself, a future pontiff. They'd whisper as I passed, maybe he's the one. I wanted to scream, I'm just a man with doubts, with struggles, with 1,000 fears I hide behind a gentle smile. But I also knew I carried their hope, and so I carried it with trembling hands. Not because I believed I deserved it, but because I believed God could still use me despite my weakness. And in that tension, between pressure and surrender, I found peace. When Pope Francis passed away, I was in prayer, and I remember feeling this strange ache, not just grief, but responsibility. I knew what the world would say. I knew the speculation would return, but I had already died to that dream. Not because I thought it unworthy, but because I had learned that my value wasn't tied to a title, that if God wanted me to serve as Pope, he would make a way. And if he didn't, then he had something better, something deeper, for me to carry. That is the freedom of surrender. It releases you from striving and anchors you in trust. So when I entered the conclave, I didn't pray to be chosen. I prayed to be obedient. I prayed that whoever was chosen would have the heart of Christ, not just the mind of a theologian. And I knew, truly knew, that if it wasn't me, it would be okay, because my goal had never been to lead the church. My goal was to love it, and love never demands a crown. It only demands the cross. That's what I held in my heart as I walked into that sacred room, robes flowing, prayers rising, trusting that the Spirit still guides the church, even when the world doubts it. The days inside the conclave were a blur of silence and solemnity, each cardinal carrying both history and hope in his hands. The weight of the church pressed into every breath we took, and yet, in that silence, I found God again. Not in the grandeur, but in the simplicity. I watched as ballots were cast, not with political strategy, but with trembling trust. I saw old men cry. I heard whispered prayers in languages I barely understood, and I realized no one was campaigning. We were all just discerning, just begging God for direction in a world spinning too fast. As the votes unfolded, my name came up. I knew it would. But something unexpected happened. I felt no pride. I felt pain. Pain because I knew how fragile the church was. Because I knew that no matter who was chosen, the burden would be unbearable without grace. And so I began to pray harder, not to win, but to yield. I asked God to give us not the most qualified man, but the most surrendered one. And when the smoke rose and my name was not called, I didn't flinch. I breathed. I whispered, "Thank you," because I knew God had spoken. The man who was chosen, Robert Prevost, surprised many, but not me. I had seen him in action, quiet, strong, deeply rooted. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't political. He was pastoral, just like the church needed. And I knew, deep in my soul, that this was right, that the Spirit had not failed us. I reached out to him that night. No cameras, no statement, just a note. "I am praying with you," because that's what brothers do. We don't compete. We collaborate. We don't fight for thrones. We fight for souls. The world didn't know how to process it. The headlines had already prepared for a different story. My face was on covers. My name trended. But God rewrote the script. And that's always been his way, to surprise the proud and strengthen the humble. I walked back to my room that evening not as a man denied, but as a man deeply confirmed. Because I had heard God's yes and his no. I had seen his will in someone else's rise. And it was beautiful, painful, but beautiful. Because only a surrendered heart can recognize the hand of God in another man's victory. In Manila, people were weeping. They had prayed so hard. They had believed so fiercely. And now, they felt like they had lost something. I understood. I wept too. Not because I was disappointed, but because I had wanted to carry their joy all the way. I wanted to show them that one of their own could be seen, chosen, lifted. But what I learned that day was this. Sometimes God lifts a nation by keeping a man grounded. And my grounding wasn't punishment. It was purpose. A reminder that representation is more than office. It's obedience. So I spoke to them, not from a podium, but from a parish. I stood among them and said what needed to be said. God's plan is perfect. I didn't sugarcoat the pain. I didn't dismiss their sorrow. But I pointed them to the bigger picture, a church led by grace, not by popularity. And I reminded them that I was still with them, still praying, still loving, still serving. Because true leadership doesn't walk away when the spotlight dims. It stays, it listens, it embraces. That's what they needed. And honestly, that's what I needed too. When the Vatican released its statement, a pause on appointments, a time for prayer, the world called it strange. But I knew better. Pope Leo wasn't stalling. He was surrendering too. He was showing the world that rushing isn't always right, that waiting can be sacred. And as I read his words, I smiled. Not because I knew what would come next, but because I didn't need to. The pause was God's punctuation, a holy comma in a story still being written. And I was grateful to be part of it, even in the quiet margins. There's something sacred about silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that settles into your soul and tells you, God is near. In the weeks following the conclave, I didn't say much. The media tried, reporters waited, friends sent messages asking if I was okay, but I didn't feel the need to speak. I had nothing to prove, no wound to explain, no disappointment to deny. I simply kept doing what I had always done, listening, praying, walking slowly through each day. Silence to me was not absence. It was invitation, an invitation to let God speak louder than opinion. I spent hours walking the gardens in Rome, not as a leader, but as a son. Sometimes I brought my breviary. Other times I brought nothing but questions. And I didn't always get answers, but I always felt peace. I would pause by a small hidden chapel, far from the tourists, kneel, and simply breathe. That became my sanctuary, not because it was ornate, but because it was honest. There, I wasn't His Eminence. I was just Luis, a Filipino boy with calloused knees and a heart still learning how to say yes. That space taught me, you don't need a title to be transformed. The world kept spinning. Headlines moved on. The buzz around my name quieted. Some saw that as a decline, but I saw it as grace. For the first time in years, I could walk unnoticed. I could listen without being dissected. I could speak without being interpreted as political. That was a gift. Obscurity has its own holiness. It refines your motives. It purifies your prayers. And it reminds you that identity doesn't come from applause. It comes from alignment with God, with truth, with the path He's chosen for you, even when it looks different than you hoped. At the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, my work continued. Meetings, memos, mission reports, nothing glamorous, but everything essential. I reviewed documents from dioceses across Africa, Asia, Latin America, voices from the peripheries, the kind of places that rarely get Vatican headlines but carry the heartbeat of the gospel. I remembered what Pope Francis always said, that the church must go to the margins. And now, I was reading their stories, their struggles, their cries for help. It was humbling. I was not left behind. I was exactly where I needed to be. In one of those meetings, a young priest from Myanmar said to me, "Cardinal, you're our voice in Rome." And I realized something profound. My influence wasn't measured in titles. It was measured in trust. They weren't looking to me to climb. They were looking to me to anchor, to stay rooted, to remember where we all came from. Dusty roads, crowded chapels, mothers who prayed us into the priesthood. And I knew in that moment, I didn't need a new office to lead. I just needed to keep being faithful to the people who had always believed in me. Faithfulness isn't loud, it doesn't trend, but it changes things. Quietly, consistently. And that's what I gave myself to. The long obedience in the same direction. I showed up. I listened. I asked hard questions. I made space for voices that had been silenced. That's what shepherds do. They don't chase fame. They chase the one sheep, the lost one, the overlooked one, the broken one. And in chasing them, they find Christ all over again. That's what I found too. Not in ceremonies, but in conversations. Not in proclamations, but in presence. If you're listening to this, maybe you've been overlooked too. Maybe you've waited for recognition that never came. I want to tell you, that doesn't disqualify you. It might just qualify you even more. Because in God's kingdom, the last are first. The hidden are lifted. The faithful are favored. Don't waste your waiting. Use it. Let it shape you. Let it strip you of what doesn't matter. Because what remains after the waiting is pure gold. Character, compassion, clarity. And in a world full of noise, those three things are revolutionary. I remember one particular Sunday, months after the conclave, when I visited a parish in Manila unannounced. I sat in the back. No vestments, no security, just me and a wooden pew. The priest didn't even recognize me until after the final blessing. And I loved that. For an hour, I was just part of the body again. No spotlight, no schedule, just worship. That's when it hit me. This is leadership. Not the kind that stands on stages, but the kind that sits in silence, joins the song and weeps during communion. I've never felt closer to Jesus than I did that day. When people asked me what I thought of Pope Leo's early days, I had only one thing to say. He listens. And that alone is a miracle. In an era of speed, he chooses slowness. In a culture of reaction, he chooses reflection. And I respect that. I trust it. Because leadership is not proven in declarations. It's proven in discernment. And I see in him a man who discerns deeply. That gives me peace. Not because I agree with every decision, but because I sense the Spirit in his steps. And that's all I need. Not control, just confirmation that God is still guiding. Eventually, the noise died down. The church settled into its rhythm again. But something had shifted. Not in Rome. In me. I no longer feared being misunderstood. I no longer craved clarity from others. I had received clarity from God. And it was this. Serve where you are, not where you want to be. Love who's in front of you, not who you wish you were leading. Be faithful with what's in your hand, not with what's on your resume. That's the heart of Christ. And that's the life I've chosen. Not reluctantly, but joyfully, freely, fully. People still come up to me. They say, "Cardinal, we prayed for you to be Pope." And I always smile and say, "Thank you. God answered your prayer, just differently." Because I truly believe that. I didn't get the title, but I got the testimony. I didn't receive the position, but I received peace. And sometimes, that's the greater gift. Titles pass, thrones change, but peace, that remains, that multiplies, that transforms. And in that peace I find my purpose again and again, a purpose rooted not in success, but in surrender. And so now I speak not from ambition, but from affection, not to prove anything, but to offer everything I've learned, to you, to the church, to the world, that your calling isn't delayed, it's being refined, that your story isn't over, it's unfolding, and that your worth is not in what you wear, but in who you love. I love Christ. I love His church. I love His people. And that is enough. More than enough. That is everything. And so, if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. Greatness in the kingdom of God is never about being seen. It's about being surrendered. I didn't sit on the chair of Peter, but I stand every day on the foundation of Christ, and that is more than enough. The world may chase crowns and accolades, but I've learned that the most powerful leaders are those who are willing to be invisible for the sake of love. You don't need a stage to make an impact. You need a heart that listens, a faith that stays, and a soul that says yes, again and again, even when no one is watching. If this testimony stirred something in you, if you've ever felt left behind, passed over, or unseen, I want you to know you're not alone. Your silence is not failure. Your waiting is not wasted. There is sacredness in hidden seasons. There is strength in surrender. And if you feel the Spirit prompting you now, don't let that moment pass. Lean into it. Step into your calling. Not when the world applauds, but when heaven whispers. That's when real transformation begins. If you found value in this story, if it reminded you of your purpose or deepened your faith, then I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Not because I need numbers, but because we're building something here. A space for truth, for testimony, for voices that don't fit the mold but still carry the fire. And if you believe the church needs more of that, more heart, more humility, more healing, then share this video. Let someone else hear what God can do with a surrendered life. Turn on notifications so you never miss when a new reflection drops. Every video is crafted with prayer, with purpose, and with the hope that someone like you will watch and remember. You are called. You are chosen. You are enough. And if you want to go deeper, I encourage you to leave a comment below. Share your story. Ask your question. We are not just a channel. We are a community, a family, and your voice matters here. Follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes reflections, daily encouragements, and glimpses of how this mission continues to grow across borders, languages, and lives. We're walking this journey together, not as strangers, but as pilgrims, as brothers and sisters, all trying to live out the gospel with integrity and joy. And your presence in this space makes it richer, stronger, more alive. Lastly, if this message resonated with you, pray with me. Pray that we would all become leaders who lead with love, not ego. Shepherds who bleed for the flock, not just speak from pulpits. Disciples who follow Christ not because it's easy, but because it's eternal. Let this channel be a spark, a starting point for something deeper in your own walk with God. Not performance, but presence. Not platform, but purpose. Thank you for spending this time with me. From my heart to yours, I pray you carry this message with courage and clarity into your own life. Don't underestimate what God can do with your yes. Even the smallest act of surrender can echo in eternity. Stay faithful, stay grounded, and stay close. I'll be here, walking with you, praying with you, and sharing more stories that remind us we're not alone. Until next time, go in peace. And remember, the quietest callings often carry the loudest impact.